welcome. It's titled Head Impacts in Women's Rugby, How They Happen and How Can We Manage Them. So CADA does some really brilliant work, I like to think, almost attacking from the top down with the dementia research. And I would like to think over at Swansea, over at the Bay campus, we're attacking from the bottom up. So we're going to try and kind of meet in the middle to really make a difference to the long-term brain health of rugby players and people in the community. So I'll get started. Also, recently there's been an unprecedented increase in the number of women who play rugby. So there are over 3 million players currently registered worldwide, who account for roughly a third of the total playing population. And whilst this influx of women into a traditionally male-dominated sport is really fantastic, currently there's a real lack of female-specific research relating to injury prevention and management. And this is really concerning, given that sports-related brain injury incidence is significantly higher in women than it is in men in gender-comparable sports. So if I just introduce head impacts, so head impacts can be caused either by a direct blow to the head or via an indirect blow to the body that transfers acceleration up through the neck and into the brain. So as your brain experiences this acceleration, it will move backwards and forwards inside the skull and crash into the inner walls of the skull. But on top of this, different parts of the brain have different densities. So when these different parts experience acceleration, they'll all accelerate and decelerate at different rates. And this means that they end up pulling and twisting each other and causing this microscopic cellular damage and shear straining that can then go on to cause our concussion symptoms. So a concussion is a subset of mild traumatic brain injury, and it can only be diagnosed by a doctor or physiotherapist, but the symptoms include things like dizziness, visual disturbance, and balance problem. And really crucially, these symptoms can occur instantly after the head impact or can take hours or days to appear. But something that's we really need to be aware of is that it's not just concussions that are dangerous. We need to look at more than just the head impacts that cause symptoms. So we call these head impacts that don't cause symptoms of concussion subconcussive. And whilst these symptoms aren't there, what we do find is that people do have very subtle deficits or alterations to their brain function. Say after a rugby match where you've experienced lots of subconcussive head impacts, or say a boxer after a session of sparring, you might find that they have slightly slow reaction times or very subtle balance problems. So there's increasing evidence of a causal association between both concussive and subconcussive head impacts and both short and long-term neurocognitive changes. So it's really important that we work with our players both to reduce the number of head impacts they experience, but also the size of these head impacts as well. So I'm just going to go through some of the consequences of concussion that aren't really common knowledge. So one of the first ones is that your risk of lower limb injury, such as sprains and tears, is 4.7 times more likely in recently concussed people than those who haven't been concussed. So there are kind of two schools of thought as to why this could happen. So the first one is that when people get concussed playing rugby, a lot of the time they do lose some of their confidence. As they have time out of the sport to recover again, they lose a bit of that skill. And this means that when they return, they're a bit out of practice, and that can influence their injury risk too. But in addition to this, we actually think that deficits to coordination and kind of coordination difficulties can occur even after the symptoms of concussion have resolved. And these coordination difficulties can still be present for up to about 6 months post-concussion. So it's really important that we work with players during their recovery from concussion to make sure that they can return to the sport safely. Secondly, we often find that players experience really poor social health during their recovery from concussion. So the symptoms of concussion can actually make it really hard to socialise. So if you have problems processing conversations, you struggle with bright lights, for example, or you're having kind of auditory disturbances, this can really lead to people kind of choosing to isolate themselves and not spend time with their friends. Particularly in rural areas, when GPs advise people not to drive whilst they have concussion symptoms, for people who can't access public transport, they really struggle to kind of get involved in the community and struggle again there. So we've been interviewing players and doing surveys and finding that what they want whilst they can't train and can't actually play rugby is they still want to be involved with their team, perhaps teaching some of the younger players or being kind of involved in committee-based decisions, just to help kind of keep them feeling like they're integrated as well. And then lastly, there's increasing evidence of a link between the number of concussions a person has had and the likelihood of experiencing anxiety or depression. So again, it's really important that we reduce any mental health stigma that is present in rugby playing environments, so players feel that they can access help as and when they need it. So kind of in the longer term, as in over a lifespan, I'm sure you'll have all seen in the news that more and more retired contact sport athletes and rugby players are coming forward with diagnoses of neurodegenerative disease. So things like early onset dementia, motor neuron disease. And we also kind of have a sports specific version of that, and we call this chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So chronic as in occurs in the longer term, traumatic means that it occurs as a result of force being applied, i.e. repetitive head impacts. And then encephalopathy is a term for kind of a diffuse disease of the brain that affects both structure and function. So you can see in the normal brain on the left that it's quite pink and full, looks kind of almost plump. Whereas if you look at the brain on the right, you can see there's a huge loss of tissue. So in CTE, the repeated head impacts cause a protein in your brain to misform and distort. And then these distorted proteins all aggregate into clumps with each other. And these clumps can then kind of kill the surrounding brain tissue. And this is why we've got so much loss of tissue in this brain with advanced CTE, because this damage does accumulate over time. So the symptoms of CTE are really detrimental to the quality of life for those experiencing it. So it includes things like cognitive difficulties, behaviour changes, aggression and tremor. And these symptoms typically appear a couple of decades after a player has finished or has retired from their elite sporting career. However, this summer we've really had a breakthrough in that Christopher Nowinski and his team of researchers have managed to find causation. So in science, it's really difficult to prove a cause and effect, but over the summer, Christopher Nowinski has managed to do this. So we can say that repetitive head impacts cause mild chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And this is going to have really huge legal implications, but also highlights that if we have cause and effect, there's an urgent research effort that needs to be done to prevent any more players experiencing this. So our research at Swansea, the aim of kind of our research team as a whole is to investigate head impact mechanisms and reduction strategies in women's rugby. And we do this through biomechanical investigations, but also some social science as well. So throughout the rest of the talk, I'll be talking a bit about sex and gender. So these terms are often used interchangeably, but they do actually refer to slightly different things. So a person's sex is their biological makeup. So the vast majority of people will either be XX female or XY male, whereas gender is much more spectral. So this refers to how a person chooses to identify and also refers to their culturally defined roles and expectations. So sex is a biological construct and then gender is a more social construct. So as I mentioned earlier, the majority of injury prevention and management data in rugby is developed almost entirely from male-only samples. However, there are numerous biological differences between males and females that limit the generalizability of male-only data to female athletes. And the first one is that we know that the female brain is more vulnerable to concussion. And this is because female brain cell axons have fewer and smaller structural supports. And this can explain why females typically take longer to recover from concussion, even when initial injury severities are similar, and typically report more severe symptoms post-concussion as well. On top of this, we also know that the female neck has less stable coupling between the vertebrae. So the vertebrae in your neck kind of interlock with each other, but the female vertebrae are shaped differently and don't interlock as well. And this limits the whole stability of your neck. And if your neck is more unstable, you're less able to keep your head stable during a head impact. And this means that your brain will experience more acceleration too. And this is why females typically are more susceptible to whiplash style injuries as well. So as I'm sure you can all imagine, on top of our sex differences, we also have numerous gender differences between men and women's rugby players. So the first one is in access to rugby. So we find that a lot of women and girls really struggle to access the sport in childhood, and this can influence their injury risk as they move up through the age groups. So men or boys typically join rugby in early childhood, and this means that they can learn the contact skills really gradually with peers of similar ages and abilities. And by the time they grow up, they're really good at the contact and their technique is pretty sound. However, the majority of women first join rugby at university having had no prior contact sport experience. And because of the way university sport is set up, it's feasible that a woman could just have a few weeks of training before they end up getting played in live matches. So there really is a stark difference between the playing experience between men and women's teams. On top of this, we also know that girls typically have poorer fundamental movement skills than boys. So this is things like balance, locomotor skills like running and jumping, and coordination. And these skills are really important to play a contact sport safely. But these differences between boys and girls aren't necessarily due to sex or biology. They're more due to the sports stereotypically played by each gender. So whilst boys might do field or contact sports and again can learn these skills really gradually, girls instead might do things like dance and swimming and don't get an opportunity to kind of really nail these skills in early childhood. Another huge difference, as I'm sure you're all aware, is the funding and resources available to men and women's rugby players. So firstly, we find that women, particularly at the community level, really struggle to get pitch-side healthcare. So as I said, concussion can only be diagnosed by a doctor. It's really difficult to identify and diagnose. So if there isn't a doctor or medical professional at the side of the pitch to help these players, we often find that a lot of concussions go unreported and unidentified. And not only is this really bad for player welfare, but it also stops a lot of our injury surveillance research as well. So currently, I don't really think we're sure how bad the concussion problem in women's rugby really is, simply because we just can't access that data. Secondly, at the elite level of the sport, we often find that women are less able to access full-time professional contracts. So if you're only offered a part-time contract, you're less able to access the club-provided medical care and training, but also you've got the additional stress of finding extra employment too. Lastly, we also find that women really struggle to access strength and conditioning resources. So these are things like your gym sessions and your fitness sessions that are not only really important for performance, but are really important in injury prevention as well. We find even at school boy and girl level, if schools do have the resources or do have the kind of funding to provide those resources are prioritised to the boys team and not the girls team. So it's worth saying that the opportunities for women in rugby are increasing all the time, which is fantastic. However, the players who are at university today and the players who would have gone to the World Cup recently would have been the players who experienced this gender gap growing up. So it's likely that these effects will remain in the population for quite a few years yet. So at Swansea, to try and work out how these players are experiencing their head impacts, we use instrumented mouthguards. So these mouthguards contain acceleration sensors that can detect a head impact as they occur on the pitch, then send that data wirelessly to our pitch-side iPads and receivers. So in our pre-COVID season, we fitted a men and women's university team with these guards and recorded all of their matches to try and work out what was going on. So some of our biggest findings from this project was that there are no significant sex differences in impact magnitude, despite the men's body mass being 22 kilograms heavier than the women's. So this finding was really unexpected. So given that force equals mass times acceleration, we would expect players with a greater body mass to experience proportionately higher head accelerations or head impacts, particularly in rugby when there are really clear differences between strength and power between the different genders. So this finding was really odd, and we went back and looked at our video footage and analysed that and coded it to try and work out specifically how these mechanisms were happening. So through this video analysis, we actually found that men and women experience their head impacts differently. So men experience the majority of their head impacts through direct contact in the tackle. So by direct contact, I mean contact between their head and the body part of another player, so hip, knee, shin type thing. And this was in the initial part of the tackle, so the initial collision, whereas women experience a much greater proportion of their head impacts via this head-to-ground mechanism. But there are also sex differences within this head-to-ground mechanism. So as the men fell, they often fell forwards and seemed able to control their head and neck. And this meant that they avoided the vast majority of head-to-ground impacts. However, as the women fell, they often fell backwards. And this meant that they couldn't tell where or when they were going to land. They couldn't brace for landing, but they also appeared to lose control over their head and neck. And this resulted in a really pronounced whiplash action of the head into the floor. So this whiplash action was really common in the women's team. So we observed it in 79% of all recorded female head to ground impacts, but we only saw this once in the male player, and this was when he'd lost consciousness before he began to fall. So I've not included a video of this impact mechanism because it's not pleasant watching. But if you can imagine this player in red, she'll get pulled over backwards. If she can't control her head and neck, can't stabilize her head and neck, we'll see this really pronounced whiplash action of the head into the floor, and it will be the back of her head that hits the floor. So what do our findings mean in practice? How can the community players benefit from this? So the first thing we've got to remember is that this is preliminary data. There's a huge amount more research that we need to do. However, we do have some funding from World Rugby to fit 70 new guards to 3 different additional women's rugby teams in the future, which is really fantastic. But in the meantime, given that the way women were falling seemed really implicated in the way they were experiencing head impacts, we do think that we could look at sports like judo to try and mitigate this. So in judo, they do a lot of fall training. It's a really fundamental skill within the sport, and people train to fall forwards, backwards and sideways. Whereas in rugby, we often find that the only time people have ever done fall training is in the first ever session where they were taught to tackle. And even then they were only taught to fall sideways. So this doesn't really have much relevance or doesn't really replicate what you'd expect or what would happen to you in a real life rugby game. So one of our collaborators, Anne Stodter from Anglia Ruskin University, will be doing some work there, which is really exciting too. On top of this, we also need more awareness for pitchside medics that men and women do experience concussions or head impacts differently. So in sport generally, as you're watching the game, your attention will be on the ball. And because men get injured in the initial parts of the tackle, kind of fairly close to the ball, you do tend to be able to pick up on their injuries more easily. However, women get injured or during the fall from the tackle when the ball's been passed on. So it's almost behind the line of your attention. So it's really important that pitchside medics are aware of this, so they do keep looking back up the pitch to check for players as well. So again, in kind of the meantime, we've been looking at neck strength as a kind of modifier of head impact magnitude in incidents too. So again, given the stability and ability to control your head and keep it off the floor was really implicated in the head impact mechanisms, we're going to try and explore this further. So it's thought that a strong contraction of your neck can help stabilize your head and limit the acceleration experienced by the brain. And we've had some really positive research come out from different areas of sport. So for every 0.45 kilograms of neck strength gained, concussion risk decreased by 5% in high school athletes. And in elite men's rugby, a 10% increase in extension strength, which is pushing back, was associated with a 13% reduction in concussion risk. So neck strength training is a little unusual, but it has been around for a long time in lots of different sports. It's fairly common in boxing, for F1 drivers, and also for fighter pilots too. But particularly with women's rugby, we find that a lot of players haven't heard of it. So as part of our kind of big research project was to introduce this neck strength testing and training to players and see how they found it. So to do our neck strength testing at Swansea, we use our custom-made isometric neck strength testing apparatus, or INSTA, that you can see in the photo on the right. So this works as the player puts their knees on this pad here, their torso on this pad here, the head in the headset, and then they'll push one by one against each of these strain gauges and we'll get a neck strength reading. So the reason we've got strapping around the Insta, this is to stop the players using any muscles that aren't their neck to make their force values a bit bigger. So we think that the muscles in the neck can become kind of the weakest link in the chain. So we really want to target on those and focus on them so we can improve them as well. And lastly, we've chosen this position for the Insta because it mimics what rugby players would do in the scrum and in the tackle as well. So we're really trying to make it sport specific for them too. So over the last year, we've been introducing neck strength training with our women's rugby team. So this started with bodyweight head lifts. So we asked the players to lie on the floor with their back against the floor. tuck their chin to their chest and then lift their head up off the floor for a few seconds, hold it, and then put it back down on the floor. So part of this was trying to improve their strength, but we were also trying to improve kind of their neuromuscular control and their coordination too. So by tucking their chin to their chest, they were actually activating their deep neck flexors, so that the muscles that are really involved in stabilizing your head and neck are the ones that run really close to your spine. And to activate them, what you have to do is put your chin to your chest and always give yourself as many double chins as you can. So if you're in a position to, you can try this. If you lie with your back flat on the floor, try and lift your head up without the chin tuck, and then try with the chin tuck. You should find that with your chin tucked, you've got a lot more control and it feels a lot easier. So we started off with these body weight head lifts, and once the players had all mastered this, we moved on to using resistance bands as well. So the players would hold them against their head and then pull their head away. And we did this training for the whole season, which ended up being 22 weeks long. So we ended up having some really positive results. So we're still working on this intervention and tweaking it so it's as good as we can get it. But we found that strength left and right increased by about 26%. Pushing down increased by 15%, and then pushing up or back increased by 9%, which is really positive. So on top of our kind of biomechanical neck strength testing, we also interviewed the players and coaches to see how they kind of found the intervention. And other than a few tweaks, they were really, really engaged with this process. So in rugby, with all the kind of media attention that concussions got, there is change coming from the unions at the top of the sport that is filtering lower down the levels. But this neck strength training really allows players to take matters into their own hands a little bit. This is a really cheap, really effective way of just protecting yourself a little bit more. So this neck strength training took 10 minutes per week and required about £5 worth of equipment. And this was shared by the whole team. So Swansea, we're really trying to make training programs or interventions that players will engage in and that is realistic and is feasible for community levels of the sport as well. So finally, what's next for Swansea? So as I said, we've got lots more mouthguards coming for us to use next season, which is really exciting. I've just finished doing some interviews with rugby players, learning about their concussion experiences, what resources they'd like, but also what those players want from us as researchers as well. I do also have a gender and rugby experiences survey. So if any of your friends and family have played rugby and would like to be involved, we're really keen to hear about what resources people have available to them, a little bit about their concussion experiences. And we're just trying to get a lay of the land, kind of what percentage of the rugby population has experienced this and what do people kind of want from us as well. So I think the link is being posted in the chat as we speak. But other than that, thank you all so much for listening. Thank you very much to CADA for having me, and thank you to my supervisors and sponsors.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Freya. That's very interesting presentation. Very nicely done as well. So we could easily follow something that I'm sure has a lot of complexity underneath it. So well done presenting that in a nice, accessible way for us all. There's a few questions in the chat and question answers. I'll start with a couple in the question answers session. Hugh Owen asked, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, but maybe expanding it a bit more, because it's quite interesting about the social implications around how the game's developed and really the professionalization of some of that. So he says, do you think the differences in coaching and professionalism levels in the game, like men have had a largely pro game since 1995 and women only much more recently, makes a difference in the type of head impact experienced by players? And are women players more at risk as the women's game professionalizes at different speeds? You kind of touched on that a little bit, but maybe expanding that on it a little bit more, and maybe you're seeing it changing a little bit in recent years.
Yeah, so we're kind of still at the point in women's rugby where it's not totally professionalised. So in men's rugby, it's the norm that every single player in the kind of 52-person squad does have a full-time playing contract, whereas a lot of professional women's rugby players still only have part-time. And you'll hear stories of them going to play in the Six Nations and then turning up for a shift, flying home that evening, turning up for a shift in the hospital the next day. And the amount of stress on these players is huge. But also, as players get paid to play, they're under a lot of pressure as well. So we find that people are kind of often, so in rugby, there's this real big element of bravado, and to an extent there has to be because it's such a physical sport. But we find that with concussion, if there's any pressure to return, and this pressure does come from professionalisation where performance is expected, they return too soon, and this is really, really dangerous. I'd like to say concussion attitudes are improving, but they're still nowhere near where they need to be just yet.
And other sports are even further behind, I think, aren't they? We saw recently in the World Cup with football that goalkeeper playing against England who wanted to carry on after being hit in the head and then unable to do so. And you're right, there's short-term implications, as you mentioned there, but also some really worrying long-term implications. Another question from Hugh related to that is asking, is there any planned research into any potential differences and impacts of differing types of head impacts, i.e. they're likely to be difference in future issues or concerns caused by head to body impact as opposed to whiplash head to ground impacts? And I think that's a really important and interesting question. Yeah, what's the long-term issues and are they different depending on what the head injury is like, I suppose?
Yeah, so we tried a bit of that in our pre-COVID season, and essentially we found no difference in impact type versus kind of the impact magnitude, but we think that's just because we didn't have a big enough sample. So we're hoping in the next year, when we've got lots more mouthguards, that something significant will pop up, and that's where we can target a lot of our efforts as well.
So what are the long-term impacts for those kind of injuries, especially in later life? That's really difficult, I know, to be able to see, the causation pathways, but it's believed there are impacts for later life. Am I right?
Yeah, I think so. There's kind of a real spectrum of consequences. So a lot of people think a concussion is feeling dizzy for a few days and being knocked out and being sick, but actually it can affect people's grades at university, at school. It can affect family dynamics, and it's particularly if you have longer term concussion symptoms. So there are stories of people having them for a couple of years, and it really does derail their life, and there's not actually a lot of support people can have. So all the way through, there does need to be more support for people, and people do need to be more aware or be educated on how they can access that support too.
Yeah, excellent. Ian Jones says these studies are aimed at senior sports, uni age plus. Is there any plans to study head injury causation and management in mini, junior or youth level for both males and females?
Yes, I think so. So the University of Bath have been running some projects recently. Kind of almost fortunately at the school level, we do find that PE teachers are relatively well trained. You've got parents on the sidelines who can step in and look after their children. Whereas at the university game, kind of that element of bravado is a bit more present, but also if your kind of parents aren't there to haul you off to hospital and drive you to A&E, even if you don't want to go, that's kind of where a lot of these concussions don't get reported and people can't access help for them as well.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thomas McCabe asks, what are are there any potential side effects of increasing neck strength?
We don't think so. So as with any kind of training in the gym, you might end up sore for a couple of days afterwards, but we just recommend that we don't do training 2 days before or 2 days after the matches as well. And anyone who's had a concussion recently should go to a physio and have their neck checked as well. That will really help them too.
Yeah. And do you, socially, do you get any resistance to people wanting to do neck strength training? I take my kids' football team under 15s and all they want to do is play games all the time. They don't even want to warm up properly now they're at that age. But luckily we've kind of built some of that into them, and football's got quite good at knowing about the physiological stuff about, building up your strength and things like that. So we do little bits of work with them here and there, but they'd rather not bother.
Yeah, and we find that all the way up into uni and professional level. Unfortunately, strength training is never going to be the most fun activity. But like you said, if you build it into the warm-up from a really early age, you almost find players will do it automatically. So it won't become a choice to do it, it will just be something that's the norm. And if that's built in at all levels, it kind of becomes sustainable, and then and then we end up with the whole country doing neck strength training and having concussion awareness.
Yeah, that leads to the next question that Debbie Williams puts on. Do you think neck strengthening should be part of the school sports curriculum for boys and girls?
This is a difficult one. So we've not done any research yet in children, so kind of getting ethical approval is really difficult as well. And there aren't really that many schools that do girls rugby. I think something that urgently needs to happen is that players need compulsory concussion education. A lot of the time, so through our interviews, we found that people learn about concussion after they have been concussed. And that's kind of a ridiculous way to learn things. So if children had age appropriate sessions that would just tell them both about the symptoms of concussion, but would squash any of this kind of stigma about reporting concussion as well, I think that would be hugely valuable.
Next question from Tom Morris, quite specific one. What were your thoughts on the handling of Abby Dow in the Rugby World Cup 2021 final? Were Progressive Rugby right to react so angrily?
Yeah, I think with the media attention that's on rugby, the amount of people that tune in and watch the World Cup, I think those media teams have an opportunity to set an example of what proper concussion care is. And if these elite teams are seen to be allowing obviously concussed players to continue, and it wasn't just Abby Dow, we've had players being obviously concussed for years and still carrying on despite all the doctors that are present at elite games. And there does need to be consequences for this. Even if the elite game showed commercials on what appropriate concussion management was, or at the end of the game, there was kind of the referee said, this happened, it shouldn't have happened, this is what you should do if you're concussed in your community game. I do think there's an opportunity to set a real good example there, and that opportunity isn't being used yet.
It's a good point, isn't it, about setting examples and like you said earlier, making it the norm a bit more to look after these things, so it comes embedded in the sport rather than it being seen as something unusual. And like you said, it's against a kind of culture of just carrying on and being tough and you can sort your way through this and not wanting to, well, I suppose, yeah, not wanting to not play, I suppose. So, yeah, you've got all those social things to battle against. So, yeah, nice supportive comment from Hugh Owen there, saying thanks for answering his questions, working for Alzheimer's Society, very interested in this and the support that Alzheimer's Society can provide to current and former and future players. Having a, you know, we all know people who play rugby. We've got family members. We want to make sure this is right, and you know, and it's one of those things where prevention is better than trying to sort it out later on down the line. But yeah, it's just about embedding it more normally in society as a whole. And Debbie Williams saying she survived a traumatic brain injury 42 years ago and was told damage was limited and recovery was improved by playing squash twice a week against a man in particular. I suppose there's examples of where if you have had traumatic brain injuries, you can improve your recovery somewhat by physiological means and playing sport and finding the right thing to do. It's not, you know, so it's different for different people, but it's still important to stay fit and active where you can and get involved in stuff like that. Tom Morris says, great presentation, giving your comments regarding brain injury symptoms manifesting sometimes hours or even days later. What's your opinion on the HIA protocol in the elite game?
My opinion, and kind of neurocognition isn't particularly my area of research, is that it's kind of not really fit for purpose. So part of the HIA is getting the player off the pitch, and you'll have these lists of questions and they'll be asked to repeat a sequence of words backwards, remember certain things. But those are kind of quite easy for players to cheat. So again, if they've got that pressure to perform, they have the baseline and they'll purposely perform badly. And players have openly admitted to purposely performing badly, so they've got kind of more leniency when they're trying to pass an HIA in the game. But on top of this, so I took part in a first aid course a few weeks ago, and the instructor was saying, if you think a person's got shock, treat for shock. It's not going to do them any harm, and you've got the best chance of protecting that. And it's slightly crazy in sport that that's not our attitude to concussion. It's, oh, are they sure they've got a concussion? Not, oh, they might have a concussion, let's assume they have and look after them then. It's kind of really stark contrast in sport to non-sporting injuries.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably all the questions that have been asked now. Any last questions for anyone? Let us know. Have you got any? I mean, what other solutions alongside sort of neck strength training are happening at the moment? Are other people involved in developing activities at other universities? I can imagine, companies are thinking about various different types of head guards and things like that, which are not probably, it's not the total solution because you're not planning long term, they're just mitigating something that's happening. But yeah, what other things are being looked at elsewhere?
So Dr. Anna Stodd has done some work into fall training with her players. I think she's writing up those results soon. Dr. Danielle Salmon is creating this, I think it's contact confident, I want to say, but it's this rugby specific warm up for players. So it involves a little bit of neck strength, a little bit of kind of coordination work that sets them up ready for contact. Some of the big rugby unions are looking to rule changes as well. So there is movement happening, but it's happening quite slowly, unfortunately.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, I don't think there's any more questions. So thank you very much again for that, Freya. A brilliant presentation, really interesting and very topical at the moment. And you're right, we've got to get these things right in sport so that they're safe, and especially if more people are taking it up at different times, and there's different levels of professionalism, different levels of money and support in the sport. So yeah, really important topic you're involved in, and yeah, good luck with the next stages of your research. Thank you very much, and thank you to everybody who came to our seminar today, and we look forward to seeing you soon at the next one. Keep an eye on our website for future seminars and webinars. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.